There's a country with 3 capital cities, 11 official languages, and a currency so undervalued that luxury feels like a rounding error. It's home to penguins that live on tropical latitude beaches, a wine region older than California's, and a peace so recent that people who lived through the alternative are still very much alive to talk about it. Most people can name exactly 2 things about this place, and at least one of them is wrong. Here's exactly what's actually going on in South Africa. Most countries settle on one capital city and call it a day. South Africa looked at that convention and decided it was for people who couldn't commit. This is a country that runs on contradiction, and once you understand the pattern, the rest of it starts to make a strange kind of sense. We're going to work through this in layers. First, how the country is actually organized, because the answer is stranger than you'd guess. Then, the cultural math that somehow works despite 11 languages competing for airtime. Then, the geography, which does more heavy lifting for the tourism industry than almost any other country on Earth. And finally, the history, because you cannot understand modern South Africa without understanding what it spent decades undoing. Let's start with the part that sounds like a trick question. South Africa has 3 capital cities, not one, not a metro area with nicknames, 3 legally distinct capitals, each doing a different job. Pretoria is the administrative capital. That's where the executive branch lives, where the president's office runs the country day to day. Cape Town is the legislative capital, which means Parliament sits there, debates there, and passes laws there. Inside a city that's an 8-hour drive from Pretoria. And Bloemfontein is the judicial capital, home to the Supreme Court of Appeal, sitting roughly in the geographic middle of the other 2, like a mediator nobody asked for. Why would any country design itself this way? The short answer is history and compromise. When the country unified in 1910, 4 formerly separate territories each wanted a piece of the new capital. Rather than pick a winner and create 3 losers, the negotiators split the government up like a group project where nobody trusts anybody else to hold the whole thing. It's inefficient. Government officials, lawyers, and diplomats spend real time and money shuttling between cities that are hundreds of kilometers apart. But it's also survived over a century of political upheaval, which tells you something. Sometimes the inefficient system is the one that's actually stable because it forces power to stay spread out instead of concentrating in one place. Nobody city gets to be the country. That turns out to matter a lot in a nation this large and this diverse. And diverse undersells it. South Africa recognizes 11 official languages. Not 2, not 3, 11, written into the Constitution with equal legal standing. Zulu and Xhosa are the most widely spoken as home languages, followed by Afrikaans, English, and a cluster of others, including Sotho, Tswana, Tsonga, Swati, Venda, Indebele, and Southern Sotho. Here's the part that trips people up. English is actually the home language of a relatively small percentage of the population. It functions as the language of business, government documents, and media, but it's not what most South Africans grow up speaking at home. This creates a country where code switching isn't a party trick, it's Tuesday. A single conversation in Johannesburg might move through 3 languages depending on who's talking to whom. Street signs, government forms, and news broadcasts rotate through multiple languages depending on the region. The nickname you've probably heard, the Rainbow Nation, was coined by Archbishop Desmond Tutu to describe exactly this, a country deliberately built to hold multiple identities at once, rather than flattening everyone into one. It's a hopeful phrase. It's also, if we're being honest, aspirational. Holding 11 languages and dozens of ethnic identities together under one flag doesn't happen automatically. It takes constant, active effort, and South Africa is still very much in the middle of that project. Which brings us to geography,
Because if the political structure of South Africa is complicated, the physical landscape is where the country actually gets to show off. South Africa sits at the bottom tip of the African continent, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet. It packs an almost unreasonable variety of terrain into one country. There's Table Mountain, a flat-topped massif overlooking Cape Town that's older than the Rocky Mountains, the Alps, and the Himalayas combined. A genuinely ancient piece of geology that happens to have a cable car on it now. There's the Cape Floral Kingdom, one of only 6 floral kingdoms on the entire planet, home to more plant species per square kilometer than the Amazon rainforest. Then there's the wildlife, which is where most people's mental image of South Africa actually comes from. Kruger National Park, roughly the size of Israel, is one of the most accessible places on Earth to see the so-called Big Five without needing a private charter flight or a 6-figure budget. Self-drive safaris are genuinely possible here, which sets South Africa apart from several other safari destinations. And then there's the coastline detail almost nobody expects: African penguins. Not in Antarctica, not in some frozen research station, on the beaches near Cape Town, at a spot called Boulders Beach, where a colony has lived since the 1980s in a place that also happens to have decent surf and sunny days. It's one of the few spots on the planet where you can genuinely go penguin watching and beach lounging in the same afternoon. The geography alone would be enough to build a tourism industry on. But the thing that actually defines modern South Africa in most people's minds isn't the mountains or the wildlife. It's the history. For nearly 45 years, from 1948 to the early 1990s, South Africa was governed under apartheid, a legal system of racial segregation that classified every citizen by race and used that classification to determine where they could live, what jobs they could hold, who they could marry, and whether they could vote at all. It wasn't informal social discrimination. It was written into law, enforced by police, and defended by the state as official policy. The system was dismantled through a combination of internal resistance, decades of international sanctions and boycotts, and negotiated political change, culminating in the country's first fully democratic election in 1994, when Nelson Mandela, who had spent 27 years in prison, much of it on Robben Island for opposing apartheid, was elected president. Here's the wrinkle most people miss. 1994 wasn't an ending, it was a starting line. The legal architecture of segregation was dismantled quickly. The economic architecture, decades of unequal access to land, education, and capital, was not something a single election could undo. And South Africa is still actively working through that gap today. Wealth inequality remains among the highest of any country in the world, and it maps closely, though not perfectly, on the old racial lines. Land reform, economic redress, and access to opportunity are still live political debates, not settled history. This matters for how you should think about visiting. Township tours, for instance, organized visits to historically black urban areas like Soweto, get dismissed by some critics as poverty tourism. But when they're run properly, led by local guides who actually live there, they function less like a spectacle and more like a walking history lesson. You're seeing the neighborhoods where the resistance movement organized, where key uprisings happened, and where a huge amount of South African music, art, and political history was actually made. Done badly, it's exploitive. Done well, it's some of the most direct cultural education available anywhere in the country. Here's the part that's genuinely useful if you're actually planning a trip. The South African rand has spent years as one of the most consistently undervalued currencies for travelers, which means South Africa quietly delivers some of the best value-for-money travel on the planet. A private safari lodge experience that would cost a small fortune in comparably wildlife-rich parts of East Africa is often dramatically cheaper here. Cape Town's restaurant scene, which regularly gets compared favorably to cities in Western Europe, runs at a fraction of the price. And the wine regions around Stellenbosch and Franschhoek, some of the oldest wine-producing areas outside Europe, offer tastings and cellar tours that would cost multiples more in Bordeaux or Napa. The safety conversation deserves a straight answer, not a dodge. Certain areas, particularly parts of Johannesburg, do have real crime concerns, and that reputation isn't invented. But it's also wildly overgeneralized to the entire country. Cape Town's tourist areas, the winelands, and the major safari lodges operate with security standards on par with any major global tourist destination, and millions of visitors move through them without incident. The nuance that gets lost is that South Africa isn't uniformly dangerous or uniformly safe. It's a large country where, like almost anywhere on Earth, the specific neighborhood matters more than the national label. So here's the whole picture, compressed. South Africa is a country that refused to centralize power into one capital, built an entire national identity around holding 11 languages together, and sits on some of the most varied and dramatic geography on the continent. Mountains older than the Himalayas, wildlife you can see on a self-drive budget, and penguins sharing a beach with sunbathers. It emerged from one of the most rigid systems of legal segregation in modern history within living memory. And it's still actively working through the economic aftermath of that system today. And right now, thanks to currency values that favor foreign visitors, it's one of the best value destinations for the exact kind of high-end experiences, safari, wine country, world-class dining, that cost a fortune almost everywhere else. It's not a simple country. It was never going to be. But that complexity is exactly what makes it worth understanding properly, instead of reducing to safaris and sunsets. The world is bigger than you think. Now you know a little more of it. Hit subscribe if you love exploring the unexpected. See you on the next journey.